Hi class, I hope you've had a good week and I hope you've enjoyed reading The Knight's Tale. It's an interesting tale, and you'll find that it has the most in common with the romance we're going to read at the end of the semester, that is Troilus and Cressida. Both Troilus and Cressida and The Knight's Tale are medieval romances. And romance doesn't necessarily mean that it involves love, though many of these stories do in fact involve love. We've come to think of romance as involving love, but in fact the word romance is from the French word roman, which refers to the novel, actually, or we call modern novels romans. It means a longer work, basically, and particularly a longer secular work, not a sacred work, not something about saints' lives or the Bible or anything like that. So it really covers quite a wide range of sins, though in the romance tradition there are a number of things that are held in common with multiple romances. One of those things is superlatives, in the sense that everyone is the best, the most beautiful. Things happen in quite dramatic ways. You may see that some of these tropes, especially the superlative used in the medieval text, are also used in today's novels. In fact, I've read Twilight, and it is certainly an example of the superlative being used, though maybe slightly less superlative than medieval romances can be. But certainly that's one of the things that's a trait. Usually they do involve a love story, but usually they also involve some kind of outside war or conflict. Medieval jousts and tournaments and wars are very popular plot items in most all medieval romances. Issues of how one was born are other issues. What's really interesting about this is you have three different kinds of material for romances in the Middle Ages. One's called the material of France, the matter of France. One's called the material of Arthur, the matter of Britain. And the other one is the matter of Troy, matter of Greece. I think it's Troy, actually. And they are rewritings of the old Trojan War and some of the aspects of Greek history. And you see a lot of Arthurian romances, a lot of Arthurian legends. The matter of France deals more specifically with Charlemagne, Charles the Great, in the earlier Middle Ages. And then you have these rewritings of older classic history. And in these rewritings of classic history, they didn't really know how the people at that time lived. They had images, they had sculptures and stuff that we still have today that they could look at and see, yeah, they dressed different. Certainly they wrote different. They had a lot of good ideas at that time, and they respected them for that. But for the most part, they didn't understand, or they didn't think about culture in the way that we think about culture. Maybe because we're exposed to so many cultures in today's world, being so global. And at the time, it doesn't mean that there wasn't quite a bit of trade going on and that people wouldn't be exposed to some of these ideas, and Chaucer himself was exposed to a lot of ideas. But most people, traveling, a horse could take you 20 to 40 miles in a day. You go on a 40-mile day, you aren't going much farther the next day, but you do 20 miles a day on average. That really makes your world much smaller. If, you don't want to travel more than a couple days from home, suddenly a 40-mile radius around your house is as big as your world may get. And so, when you take that into consideration, that their exposure to different cultures was much more limited than ours. And so the way they saw cultures was the way they basically interpreted through their own cultural lens. And so they plant on top of Greek stories things like knights and ladies and tournaments. Not that war and love between women and men didn't occur at the time. Obviously it did. They told similar stories in those respects. But it didn't occur in the medieval respect of how we understand courtly love or how we understand chivalry and kind of a knight's code. They had honor codes at the time, but it wasn't quite in the same shape that the Middle Ages had it in. And and another thing they like to do is they kind of like to, they'll talk about older gods since it's an older story, and you have to kind of respect that at the time, since the story is taking place at a time when those older gods were supposedly active, they will include those deities in their stories, but they also often make references to the Christian God, and just kind of plant him in there, whether or not he would have actually been current with the story or not, because they're just kind of reinterpreting the story through their culture. And you see that a lot through The Knight's Tale. Excuse me. Anyway, but Rio, lay down. Sorry, that's my dog. He's going everywhere and inspecting lots of things. He thinks he sees something interesting. Anyway, so we have The Knight's Tale. It starts off, you have the knight in the general prologue, and as we talk about, he's one of the few characters that's described entirely positively. First of all, he's not considered to be overly dressed, especially for his station, where he would have been expected to be dressed quite well. But he's not. He's actually dressed, in fact, he's still dressed in the attire he went to war in. And as you read the huge list of names of all the places he's been, including in the Crusades, what it's supposed to symbolize is how well he has fought for the church and fought for his country, and how experienced he is actually in battle. And that he's an experienced knight, so he doesn't just talk about it, but he really gets out there and he does fight. And he's a fairly well-educated man. In a way, he presents himself like Chaucer's narrator in the sense that he doesn't want to reveal himself as learned in the sense of talking directly about it. He would rather show you. And so you see instead, he uses a lot of rhetorical devices, makes a lot of references to classical literature, just the story itself, to show that he is in fact learned, to show that he is in fact well educated. So he doesn't tell you he's well educated. In fact, he says, as he's telling a story, he says, weak are the oxen in my plow, meaning, I'm not so good at this storytelling thing. But then he's really trying to go back behind that and actually say, no, I really am good at this storytelling thing by telling a really good story and telling it, I think the right word would be correctly. He really is trying to tell this story in the most correct, kind of perfect, typical medieval romance manner. He's not trying to subvert or use irony or any of those sorts of things. That's not how The Knight's Tale is. The Knight's Tale is really pretty straightforward, and the knight wants it to be that way. You're supposed to read him as a narrator that way. And what's interesting, I want you to think of this as you're reading the tales, is we've kind of got a layered narrative approach here, because we have the knight who's characterized as a good man, who's active in war, is well educated, is at the top, he's in the aristocratic class, and then you've got the narrator of the entire Canterbury Tales that is narrating the knight, and then you have Chaucer as author, kind of outside of all of that, and his own aims as an actual medieval person. And so we've kind of got this triple layering of narration in the story, and there will be some stories where you won't just have the 3 primary levels of narration, but you can get 4 or 5 layers of narration, actually, and that can get very interesting. But with the knight, he is trying to tell this typical story, and one of the things you'll see is that the knight telling a romance, and since the story is a love story, it's from, the Il Tiseda, Boccaccio. The other source for this story is Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and the Figure of Fortune, and one of your links has information about that. So I always get Boethius and Boccaccio mixed up because they both start with B. But anyway, Boccaccio's Il Tiseda, same story, and it is longer than this one. So Chaucer cuts it down a bit for the Canterbury Tales. Anyway, but as we've already discussed, Chaucer doesn't really make up any of these stories. Most all of them have some kind of outside source, and he's reinterpreting them and placing them into a character's mouth in order to further characterize that tellteller. Anyway, and so we have the Tiseda, and part of that story obviously is the love story, but the knight is not actually all that comfortable with the love story side of things. Certainly it occurs, and you have both knights falling in love very, very quickly, as I'm sure you noticed, and you're like, well, here is really the whole love at first sight thing. And that is really what it is. And at the time, they did believe in that kind of whole Cupid's arrow. It hits you and you immediately fall in love. And that's kind of one of the tenets of true courtly love is just this instant sort of thing. And that happens more in stories than it does in fact. Though that's not true of every love story, but many of them it is. And so you have this, and the fact is, as far as the love scenes, you just don't really see much interaction between Emily or Palamon or Asita. What you see a whole lot more of is violence. The knight is comfortable with violence. He's a warrior. He's comfortable with that martial ethos of fighting. And we know he's very skilled in it. He's been many, many places. And so he tells us a lot about fighting and a whole lot less about love. He does describe Emily as being beautiful, but that's kind of appreciating her from a distance. Again, we don't see the relationship of love really develop. We get a few mentions of it towards the very end of the story when Palamon and Emily finally marry, but again, it's one of those things. We have... he's not as comfortable with that, and he spends quite a bit of detail describing the tournament arena and describing the actual fights. And of course, you have two kinds of tournament activities. One of those is the individual joust, two knights running at each other with lances on horses. And then you have what's called the melee, which is a big group of knights, two groups actually combating each other. It's more of a team thing. And... but they were kind of judged individually as well, the leaders of those individual melee groups. And you would have sometimes 3 or 4 melee groups. Anyway, and that was really how they would close out tournaments. And it was really the big important thing and was supposed to be training for actual war. And so that's what you're seeing here when they bring in 100 more knights or whatever. That they're bringing in those knights in for a melee. And that is, in fact, what happens. And, of course... another interesting thing you have here is, of course, the battle between Palamon and Arcita in the forest, which ends up with them both being pardoned. That's also kind of stretched out. And they even get into a verbal kind of conflict when they first see Emily in the tower. Again, this is more about conflict. And another thing you can note, perhaps, about this is that in the temples, when all 3 temples are described, I think you'll notice the imagery in those temples is very dark. There's not a happy scene. Love may be achieved in Venus's temple, but it always ends really badly. And the same for Diana's temple and the same for Mars. And there's two reasons behind that, I think. Again, it kind of comes back to the knight and what he's comfortable with and his sort of dark existence being so involved with martial things. But also, I think it reflects an attitude in the Middle Ages that, okay, this story happened long ago, so they believed and prayed to gods, and so, yeah, the story has to have the gods in it, but we're going to make sure that whoever's reading in the current time makes sure they continue to believe in the Christian God by showing older gods as these kind of dark, demonic sorts of figures. And so, much of the imagery they're using then for that is really quite dark and violent. And... another interesting thing you see here is women are really kind of, they're ciphers, they're objectified. Both Hippolyta and Emily are Amazons, and so you'd expect them to be really strong, powerful warrior women, and yet they don't act that way at all. It's kind of like the minute that they're defeated, supposedly, and of course the whole story takes place after that defeat, they act like your perfect virginal medieval woman. And they obey their male master, and they bow down to those demands. Now, Emily does desire to remain a virgin. So she does pray to Diana for that position of power. And we had talked about last week about how virginity at the time was, in fact, power, especially for women. We see that as a clear example here. But she is, in fact, denied it. And certainly that's part of the plot, but, that must also make us think about the knight and how aristocratic men would view women, especially strong women who can kind of call things into question, like Amazons, because they kind of bunk the general view of womanhood, women as property, and women as poor, lowly, inferior, especially inferior to men in physical prowess. And so we have to make them appear correct. in order to kind of keep the status quo or portray the status quo. You will not, in fact, see that through the entire Canterbury Tales. Just because you see it here does not, in fact, mean that that is all we will see through the tales. In fact, there are many tales that do call into question the status quo. In fact, the next one we read will, in fact, do that. But this one doesn't. This one, in all ways, really is trying to show that this is the status quo, this is the way it should be, with your Duke Theseus at the top, and men at the top and reigning over women, men getting their desires. And of course then you do see the turnaround of words, though, because Palamon prays for victory in love, Arcita for victory in war. And both of them get what they want, because Arcita does win the tournament, wins Emily's hand, but then he is killed, and by Saturn breaking in. And this is kind of the whole idea of fortune. And as soon as fortune's wheel has spun to the top, well, it just spins right back down again, and you will fall. And but Palamon gets Emily in the end. He gets victory in love after the death of Arcita. And, so these are some turning things. One of the things I would comment on is in most of these tales, a common motif you see is that the tellteller, the knight in this instance, will identify with one of the characters in the story. We've already said that he's fairly uncomfortable with the idea of love, so he doesn't, in fact, seem to identify with Palamon or Arcita. Who he does seem to identify with is actually a powerful character in the story, but not necessarily a central character, and that is the Duke Theseus. The Duke Theseus is certainly a catalyst to the action in the story. He keeps the story moving. It is his power and his decisions that bring about the tournament and those sorts of things. But other than that, he certainly takes a background role when compared to Palamon, Arcita, and or Emily. But nonetheless, he is a powerful character, and he does fight, and he himself doesn't really get all that involved in acts of love. And so I think the knight himself would identify well with him. Here's a landowner who's powerful. That's how I want to be, how I am. And, his relationships with other people are relatively simple. He's in control, they're not. And that seems to be what the knight respects. The knight respects that kind of power. And so he seems to identify with Duke Theseus the most. If you think he identifies with someone else, I would certainly like to hear from you. Some might say he might identify with Arcita as well, for his martial prowess, I suppose. But in the end, I guess it's sort of fair, since Palamon is the one that sees Emily first, so he's the one that gets her in the end. But, again, it's one of those things. We've got several themes here. The idea of kind of the courtly love, the correct, beautiful woman. We fall in love at first sight. We have to grief to the point of dying after seeing a lover and having kind of this whole unrequited love story, very common in medieval romance. We'll see that again in Troilus and Cressida. It's this really over-the-top, superlative sort of love story, and that just continues on and continues on. You also see kind of the wilderness being placed in opposition to society, and you see that here when Palamon and Arcita, they're kind of going crazy when they're out in the woods, and you have kind of the more formal, recognized conflict between them in the tournament grounds, where it's really been constructed just for that purpose, and that's more recognized. And gardens appear frequently, women in gardens appear frequently, and that's usually a reference back to Eve and how she tempts Adam. And her tempting Adam in the Middle Ages is not just read as a straightforward temptation. It's read as lust, especially because virginity and chastity at the time were such big things. So when you see Emily appearing in a garden and the men watch her and they fall in love with her and they're tempted, that is really kind of a rereading of that Genesis story. And there are more of those. And if you read The Romance of the Rose ever, which we won't read it in this class because it's not by Chaucer, but if you ever read it, that's certainly another motif that shows up there. Anyway, I think this is a lot of the ideas that the Knight's Tale covers. And if you have any questions, just let me know, and look forward to hearing from you.